Good morning and welcome to another cuppa session, and we're going to introduce a fantastic theory of teaching called explicit effective instruction. You might have heard it as explicit direct instruction.
Thanks, Linnell. Just apologies this morning because I've got a bit of a sore throat. So bear with me. We're going to be looking at a way of teaching that is very high impact and works for many students. Before we start talking about teaching, we need to understand what learning is. The change in knowledge and or skills that is maintained over time. So it's not like growing older or growing your hair longer, which we all do without any effort. This is something that we need to put effort into in order to change what we know or what things we can do.
And we've got to understand that ourselves as teachers and help children to understand that just because they turn up to the classroom doesn't mean they're suddenly going to know. You know, like the little kindies might go home after the first day of school going, great, I've learned everything, I don't need to go back tomorrow. Yeah, so learning takes effort. And some of those children who get really frustrated that they can't do something straight away because they think they should just know it. And again, we've got to explain that learning takes time.
Yep.
And effort.
And so this model that we're looking at sits within the model of explicit instruction, which comes from intensiveintervention.org. Now, this is the website. It's an American website. And what I love about it is that it does connect very clearly academic and behavioural interventions on the one website. So you can choose which path. And that sort of parallels our can't versus won't really nicely. So the won't would be the behavioural side and the can't would be the academic side. And you can see their overall model of explicit instruction, which has at the start of it your setting of clear objectives, your learning outcomes. And then at the end, you've got your other supportive practices that support the learning.
Yeah.
And
I'll just go back to that clear objective scale is that some teachers are being taught to write learning intentions and success criteria.
Yep.
And they would fit that.
Yep. Yep. They certainly would. And I'd probably suggest very strongly that those success criteria and learning intentions are very much more specific than a curriculum outcome.
Oh, yes, have to be.
A curriculum outcome is something that covers a unit of work, whereas what we want for a lesson is something very much more specific here. But our focus on the next slide is on just that middle section, and that's why I've pulled it out here on the part where we have our I do, we do, you do, or modelling, guided practice, independent practice. You will notice the American spelling in there with the single L, and you'll notice as well that that doesn't just involve the clear explanation and modelling. It also involves specifically selecting examples, and those teaching examples are really important.
And that sequence you were talking about, the sequence of difficulty and how long you stay on each one depending on your classroom.
Yep, that's exactly right. And the guided practice is when you're working with the students and working through some more specific examples that you have planned, where you're starting to let them complete parts of it and checking all the time that they can complete it. And then you're moving them to independent practice where you do means the students are doing it. Yep. And what you'll see on the next slide is that we've added in there Rosenshine's lesson review up the front, because really, and we'll talk about this in a minute, you need to find out what the students already know before you start your actual teaching. And that's really our specific focus in this 10-minute session, is just on review. Because the most important predictor of learning is what you already know. So all I've done here is I've moved those two boxes, the orange one and the brown one, sat them on top of each other and put them within Rosenshine's lesson structure, because that's exactly where this has come from. You can see the reference there. That is a free downloadable PDF. If you just Google Rosenshine 2010 Principles Instruction, you can download that whole PDF. And that's basically what we're going to be talking about when we discuss effective explicit teaching.
And it's a great article. Highly.
Yep.
Don't skip over that one. Definitely worth reading. And
what's really important in that lesson is the immediate corrective feedback when you're marking it as a whole class. Oftentimes, students will make similar errors. And when you rework them, you're not just feeding back to one student, you're feeding back to a group of students. And you're feeding back immediately, because the worst thing that can happen is for those students to keep practicing those errors.
That's right.
A typically practiced error that I know we found very difficult to change in a special intensive reading classroom was handwriting. Once students have that practiced and they're writing a 7 from the top up, or they're writing a B as a back to front 6, those are so practiced because they've repeated them so many times. What you've got here is what I see as the purposes, and I think Lynelle agrees with me with these two types of review. There's type 1 and type 2. You can see Hattie's effect size there, that when you begin a lesson, you need to check that students understand and remember whatever they learned in the last lesson. You're also confirming that they're attending to you and they're engaged in what it's about. You're hoping students will be responding and say, yes, I remember learning X or Y last lesson and I could do that last lesson. Yeah. And giving you some examples, that would be the successful student response, and you would continue on. Yeah. But, you know, sometimes that doesn't happen.
And it's so vital. And I know one of the biggest pushes with numeracy is that we help students see the relevance of the mathematics to real life, because that's getting into the numeracy. And that actually is part of the attention and engagement as well, in that they see, why am I learning this? It's relevant.
So, you know, if they're not engaged, if they can't respond orally in a correct way as to what they learned last lesson, you've got to consider whether you're going to repeat that lesson, because they may not have learned it. And if you're moving on, that's going to leave a hole in their learning.
I know. And that's such a dilemma for teachers, I know, is that the feeling that I've got to move on and I've got this all programmed, and they've got this feedback from the kids that says, I don't know it. And we probably haven't got time today to talk about that, but we will need to talk about that. How are we going to address that? How are we going to address it for some of the kids who aren't ready, but some are?
And the classic quote for that is, are you teaching a unit of work in 4 weeks, or are you teaching students and you want them to learn?
Good answer.
And that's the decision that every teacher has to make. We can't make that for you. But
I can hear some parts of this are also coming into assessment, whether we're going formally or informally. That's helping us work out what the students already know and can do too.
Exactly.
So we could have done a little formal assessment maybe before we launch into our unit of work.
Well, yeah, and really when you're using this review to start the lesson, you're using assessment as learning. In other words, it's during the lesson. So we often have assessment for learning, which helps us plan, and that's really what Review 2 is about. Review 2, as you can see on the bottom of that slide, is around when you're starting a unit of work. You need to check what your students already know and can do, because most units of work, regardless of whether they're literacy, numeracy, history, geography, or whatever, you're going to have a range of different levels of background knowledge. And the students who have a lot of background knowledge have a lot to build on. They're going to be bored if you waste their time, and hence your behaviour problems will happen. So you can differentiate. You can use those students if they have sound background knowledge to actually support other students, pair them up with students who don't have that knowledge.
You're saying if this sharing of background knowledge is happening at the beginning of the lesson or unit, the others are learning from that, they're listening to it, and it may trigger their own background knowledge. So, oh yeah, I went fishing too,
exactly.
and I can understand how that relates to this, and you know, the neurons can start sparking.
That bringing back of a memory from long term, that's really what Review 2 is about.
Yeah.
And in that process, when the students are sharing, they're sharing it at a different level of language to the teacher. So it's more at the level of the other students. And that is, you're right, that can trigger their long-term memories. Good to know that when we're presenting these ideas about teaching and learning, ideas about your lesson materials, that they are backed up by research, because otherwise we're starting from scratch. We don't need to be reinventing the wheel all the time.
No, a lot of powerful research behind this particular method of teaching that we've shared with you today. So we better leave it there. As we've promised, on Thursday evening, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia time, we will get back and share with you, answer your questions about anything around this, post them in the group, and we'll talk more about literacy and numeracy examples. But thanks again for joining us for a coffee today, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday.